Namaskar. Welcome to this edition of Weekly Dialogues. Today I am going to talk about the falsification of history in Indian education. I will take you back to the history of this falsification and I will trace a general route through which this falsification proceeded through a number of decades. And actually in the education system it is still going on, but it's only in the last 4 or 5 years or maybe about 10 years that a pushback has begun through the social media. It begins with the establishment of Aligarh Muslim University. As you know that the Aligarh Muslim Oriental College, or rather the Anglo-Muslim Oriental College, was established in 1867. And after Madan Mohan Malviya had established the Banaras Hindu University, it became a matter of prestige for the Indian Muslims also to convert this Aligarh Muslim Anglo-Oriental College to a university. And in 1920, Aligarh Muslim University came into existence. The Anglo-Muslim Oriental College got converted into Aligarh Muslim University. It of course derived its strength from the founder Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, who is hailed by a number of people, especially the falsifiers of today's history, the leftists. They call him a great reformer. What was his reform? Actually what had happened was that the 1857 revolt, it had two different dimensions for Hindus and Muslims. For Hindus it was a true struggle for independence, whereas the Muslims had taken their clue from Shah Waliullah. Who was Shah Waliullah? Shah Waliullah was son of the person who had written the Fatwa-e-Alamgiri. Fatwa-e-Alamgiri is a very important document. Fatwa-e-Alamgiri is supposed to have been written at the behest of Aurangzeb. And a number of people regard this as an authentic command to them, true fatwa. They also regard Aurangzeb as their wali. And being their wali, he had the authority to dictate this fatwa to them. So this Fatwa-e-Alamgiri's author's son was Shah Waliullah. Shah Waliullah found, when he got into his adolescence and adulthood, that the Mughal Empire had collapsed. In fact, the Mughal Empire had started collapsing right in the 1670s and 1680s. It was because of Shivaji that Aurangzeb had to spend the last 40 years of his rule in the Deccan, and that actually spelled the end of his empire and Mughal Empire. And not only the end of the Mughal Empire, also complete collapse of the Mughal Empire. To tell you the truth, it happened in the lifetime of Aurangzeb. Queen Tarabai actually chased him when he was trying to retreat to Burhanpur. And it was during that chase that he died in Ahmednagar. And a lot of his army actually got destroyed in that process. So the great wali was actually I would call not a retreater, but he was the great fugitive at the time he died. And that was 1707. Immediately after 1707, the collapse set in. The Marathas started gaining ascendancy. In about 30 or 40 years, they had complete hold over Delhi. In fact, the Delhi emperor, he was no longer emperor. And you must have heard that famous adage about Shah Alam, Shah-e Alam, Aj Dilli Tap Alam. That Shah-e Alam, the emperor of the world, his territory extends from Delhi to Palam. That was the extent to which the Mughal Empire had been reduced. Maratha flag used to flutter proudly along with the Mughal insignia from the Red Fort. It was at that time that Shah Waliullah started his frenzied courting of outside Muslim sultanates, outside Muslim kingdoms. He was the one who ultimately got Ahmad Shah Abdali, then the Rohilla chieftain or the Rohilla ruler of Rohilkhand, Najibullah, and the Shia ruler of Awadh, Asafullah, together. The result was the Battle of Panipat in 1761. In the Battle of Panipat, Marathas were defeated, but that defeat was temporary. Within a few years, within less than a decade, they had again established their ascendance, and not only established their ascendance, they actually went right up to Attock, and it was truly said that that was one time when Marathas were ruling from Attock to Cuttack. Under these circumstances, Shah Waliullah's son was Abdul Aziz. He continued that education of the Indian Muslims. He started calling India as Darul Harb, the house of war. You must be knowing this connotation or this particular Islamic identification of Islamic lands as Darul Islam and non-Islamic land as Darul Harb. In Darul Harb, the duty of a Muslim according to Sharia is to either oppose and try and convert Darul Harb into Darul Islam or quit Darul Harb. Abdul Aziz had a very able disciple in Sayyid Ahmad Barelvi. He actually belonged to Rai Bareli, but is still called Barelvi. You should not confuse him with Ahmad Raza Barelvi, who founded the Barelvi sect. So what happened was that Sayyid Ahmad Barelvi was sent by Abdul Aziz to get indoctrinated in the Arabian lands of Hijaz, in Mecca and Medina, and he came back suitably indoctrinated and was so badly indoctrinated that he started a movement to rid India of Darul Harb. By this time, Maratha power had declined, the British had gained ascendance, and the British would not let him budge. So he found an easier target and he actually went to Punjab. Punjab was under Maharaja Ranjit Singh at that time, and he started his jihad in Maharaja Ranjit Singh's terrain. What happened was that in his very first battle in Balakot, Kunwar Sher Singh killed him, defeated his forces, beheaded him, burnt his corpse. Now just imagine, such a great mujtahid, the person who was there to carry out ijtihad. Ijtihad means reform in Islamic terms. And the great mujtahid was not only beheaded, but he was actually burnt and his ashes were scattered in the wind around Balakot. This is also the significance of Balakot when we talk about the second surgical strike and the strike on Balakot. I think at that time Sayyid Ahmad Barelvi's name had come quite much into prominence. So that is the connection. After Sayyid Ahmad Barelvi, then his disciples, they got busy in trying to revive the Mughal Empire. Now this dream of reviving the Mughal Empire has been with the Muslims for a very long time, the Indian Muslims. This was also one of the reasons for partition, because they expected that they would have their own staging posts from where they could again restore the Mughal Empire in the whole of the subcontinent and revive the great glory of the Mughals. So Devband was founded after the 1857 rising had failed. 1857 rising, as I mentioned, was inspired by this great thought of revival of Mughal Empire. At that time, the Indian nationalists or the Hindu nationalists and the Muslim revivalists, they got together. British removed the East India Company, Crown took over India directly into its hands. Queen became the Empress of India. And after that, the British set about exacting their retribution. They were very harsh, and therefore almost everybody went into hiding. It was at that time that Sir Syed Ahmad came into prominence. He started writing letters to the British pledging his allegiance. At the same time, some other Maulanas who were disciples of Syed Ahmad Barelvi, 3 of them, and the Nathvi, Gangohi and Ashraf Ali Thanvi, they set up the Deoband Madrasa, which later on became the Darul Uloom Deoband, and which we now know as the Deobandi sect. So Deoband has its roots in Shah Waliullah and Aurangzeb. After that, what happened was that Sir Syed Ahmad, he managed to convince a lot of people and a lot of the feudatory Hindus who were his peers. Because he was himself a feudal. He got a lot of assistance from the Hindu feudatories. In fact, the Aligarh Muslim University land was also donated by a Hindu zamindar. But Sir Syed Ahmad, after realizing that it was not possible to defeat the British, he started on a different track altogether. He started sucking up to the British, and at the same time he started preaching Islamic supremacism to the Muslims. And he talked about ijtihad or reform. That was a reform in a very limited sense, because the real ijtihad that had happened in the Islamic world had happened in the 8th and 9th and 10th centuries, when people had actually tried to reinterpret the Quranic edict and had tried to find out immanence of divine within the Quran. That's a different story which I have talked about in some other context. But this ijtihad was only to the extent of adopting British education and British science. A lot of conservative elements within Muslims opposed even this. Sir Syed Ahmad was called a kafir, but then Sir Syed Ahmad was very clear that he was actually for the re-establishment of the Mughal supremacy that he had learned from the people like Syed Ahmad Barelvi and his followers. That was the time that Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, he propounded the two-nation theory. He was the first person who articulated it in these terms. Otherwise, the concept of Ummat and the Islamic Ummat being separate from all other nations or all other communities has existed right from the time of the Prophet. So that's a different matter. Then Sir Syed Ahmad was followed by Muhammad Iqbal. Then came this Aligarh Muslim University, and this Aligarh Muslim University, a certain school of history called the Aligarh School came about. Why I am giving you this background is that you must understand the background to this Aligarh School of History. Who founded this Aligarh School of History? This is very interesting. This Aligarh School of History was founded by Muhammad Habib. Muhammad Habib was the father of the famous / infamous Irfan Habib. Now please don't ask me who Irfan Habib is. I think almost everybody knows after his attack on Shri Arif Muhammad Khan. So this Irfan Habib, the doyen of the leftist historians today, is the son of Muhammad Habib, who started this Aligarh School of History, which was a Marxist school of history. He was a Marxist. His able disciple was Satish Chandra, who also you know as one of the great writers of that pamphlet, the communalism in Indian history. Satish Chandra and Nurul Hasan. Who was Nurul Hasan? Nurul Hasan was India's education minister, independent minister of state for education from 1971 to 1977. And this was soon after the establishment of Jawaharlal Nehru University as a compromise between Mrs. Indira Gandhi and the leftists who were supporting Mrs. Indira Gandhi after she had created a rift within Congress. The syndicate had moved out. The leftists had started supporting her. But we are getting a little ahead of ourselves. So this Aligarh School of History started a very insidious and a very effective subversion of the history that was written by the Indians, especially during the Renaissance period. We count the Renaissance period from about 1860, after the First Indian War of Independence of 1857. And we had such great luminaries as Jadunath Sarkar, as R.C. Majumdar, and great history and greater history writing, very, very focused, very, very rigorous methodology of historiography being adopted. All this we had seen, and Indian history had gone through a great golden period. Indian history writing, let's say. This gentleman, Muhammad Habib, started subverting all of this. First, what he did was that he started whitewashing the atrocities of the invaders. Why was that important? Because by that time almost everybody knew, and even the Muslim historians did not grudge that, because they knew that the experiences of the Hindus came out of their lived experiences. The history had been written by the Mughal historians. It was well documented by Eliot and Dawson in that seminal book that is called Indian History as Told by Its Own Historians. It's a 12-volume book. And I recommend it to everybody who is actually interested in knowing the real history of the Muslim period, of the Islamic period. So Muhammad Habib started sowing the seeds of doubt, and it says that the first thing that they said that whatever is written by the Islamic historians is not correct, because they were basically court historians, and they intended to and they tended to exaggerate the Islamic zealotry of their rulers, which was not the case, because they were very noble. Then they brought in what is called the economic reasons of history writings, the economic methodology of history writing, in which they started treating everything as coming from an economic standpoint, so that the Aurangzeb's collapse did not happen because of his bigotry and zealotry, but it happened because there was a revenue crisis. These kind of things started appearing. Then they also started using their influence within the Congress party. This is very interesting. How Muhammad Habib came to influence the Congress party is also a very interesting chapter. And they started subverting the history writing of the other people. Especially Jadunath Sarkar was their prime target. After the Khilafat movement had collapsed, there was an element within the Congress party which was disgruntled with Mahatma Gandhi, and they broke off and formed their own parallel party. It was called the Khilafat Swaraj Party. The Khilafat Swaraj Party was headed by Chittaranjan Das, and its Secretary General was Motilal Nehru. Now, Muhammad Habib joined the Khilafat Swaraj Party. Muhammad Habib joining the Khilafat Swaraj Party meant that he came very close to Motilal Nehru. And it is from there that his proximity to the ruling establishment of the Congress party, and later on the ruling establishment of the Indian government post-partition began. He started exerting his influence on the Nehrus, and through Nehrus a number of congressmen. It is from there that you will see that different kind of history appearing. In fact, if you read the Discovery of India, the Discovery of India very faithfully reflects Muhammad Habib's views. If you try and read it dispassionately, you try and compare it with the history as has been written from the Indian point of view, this particular aspect will be reflected very clearly. Now, after the partition, what happened was that Maulana Abul Kalam Azad was made the Education and Culture Minister. And he remained the Education and Culture Minister till his death. That's almost 10 long years. In these 10 long years, he had this vision that they should not look too deeply into the Mughal and pre-Mughal history, because that would create rift, because it was not something that was very, very savory. In fact, it was very, very unsavory as far as the Hindus were concerned, and they had suffered the partition, they had the experience of the partition, they had the experience of the partition riots, they had the experience of being totally deceived and totally stabbed in the back by Muslim League and Muhammad Ali Jinnah. Under those circumstances, it was probably, I would say, expeditious for the moment, but in the long term, very insidious, that Maulana Azad inaugurated that policy of, I would not say whitewashing, but veiling a lot of the unsavory history of Muslim period of India, of medieval India. There are always two points of view to this. Dr. Ambedkar had very clearly said that, in fact he said this to Congress, and before the partition, it's written there in his that famous book, Pakistan or the Partition of India. He said that Congress completely fails to understand the difference between appeasement and settlement. Similarly, while writing history, also, I think it is always better to write the true history, because writing true history means that even if there are two communities which have certain misgivings about each other, when you write true histories, then they come to know the true history and some sort of a settlement takes place. Whereas when you do whitewashing, then that wound keeps festering. One side feels elated and one side feels aggravated, and one side feels very, very wounded. So because of this policy of suppressing Mughal history, and later on, after 1967, when the communists came to control the academia completely, this project gained such an acceleration that for about 40 years there was nothing but what I would call the communist history writing. It is that period in which you saw people like Romila Thapar, Bipin Chandra, Satish Chandra, I already mentioned, then Irfan Habib, of course, he was the great inheritor of the mantle of Muhammad Habib, his father. And this Marxist school of history writing, it not only dominated historiography, it also very carefully, as is the habit of the Marxists, completely shut out all other competing points of view. And people like very eminent historians like Sitaram Goel, like Ram Sarup, were completely obliterated. In fact, I had not heard of them till about 10 years back. It was only 10 years back, after Sitaram Goel had died, that I started reading his work. And then I realized what kind of falsification and what kind of whitewashing has been done by these Marxist historians. Therefore, I would end this session by telling you that that particular era of Marxist domination is ended. Please, in this age of internet and in this age of social media, you have all the tools to go and explore the real history and look at the real resources and the real sources, find it out for yourself. Look at people like Jadunath Sarkar, look at people like Ishwari Prasad, people like R.C. Majumdar, go through their works, look at the works of Sitaram Goel, look at the works of Ram Sarup, look at the works of people like H.V. Seshadri. In fact, read Dr. Ambedkar's views himself and find out for yourself how much of our history of freedom struggle is written correctly. Please do this exercise. I am sure you will find it very fulfilling. Thank you.
Press the bell icon on YouTube and don't miss another update.